Okay, up to this point, we've seen how we can go about creating various objects. We've seen how we can go about selecting and deselecting these objects. Now, we need to talk about manipulating the objects.
That's right.
And when I say manipulating, what I mean in this particular case is transforming the objects.
Yes.
Now, what does it mean to transform an object? Because it does not mean to deform it.
That's right. It doesn't mean to change it into anything.
It means to move it, to rotate it, or to scale it.
That's right. Whenever we say transform an object in this class, we are referring to moving, rotating, or scaling the object.
That's right. Now, we've seen the move, rotate, and scale tool briefly throughout several of the different lessons that we've had so far. This lesson is going to focus on creating, or not actually creating objects, but it's going to focus on these tools a little bit closer.
Sure.
And manipulating objects around, moving these objects around. And for those of you guys that are beginners, this is going to be really important because we're going to stress about transforming objects in 3D space and how it can be really easy to kind of get lost in the perspective view when working.
Right, and we'll talk about that as we get into it. First, let's go ahead and start with the Move tool, and I'll begin by creating a NURB sphere, and let me hit 5 because I like looking at that shaded viewport. And let's just start by moving this object with the Move tool, or at least talking about the Move tool. So I'll click on it over here. Of course, I could have alternately hit the W key on the keyboard. Now, let's begin with a discussion of the manipulator for the Move tool. That is this cool three-pronged thing you see here in the middle of my sphere. It has 3 arrows, one pointed up, one pointed in each direction, I guess you could say. So, what do each of these mean? Well, if you look in the lower left-hand corner of your screen, you'll notice the axes for your scene. You have the x-axis, the z-axis, and the y-axis, with y pointing up in Maya. So we have the exact same thing here on our manipulator. We have an x-axis that we can click and drag. Notice when I click on it, it has now become selected. It is yellow. I can drag in that one axis. I can drag in any axis I like. And with these 3 axes, I have all the power I need to put an object anywhere in 3D space, very accurately. Now, right in the middle of my manipulator, which might be a little bit hard to see, and there's really not much I can do to help that. If I zoom out, there you go. There's a little yellow square right in the middle of this manipulator. Now, what this is going to do is allow us to move our object perpendicularly to the screen. It's kind of like moving our object along the screen.
Or parallel to the screen, perpendicular to the camera.
Sure. I see what you're saying. Yeah, absolutely. Now, if you look over here inside my channel box, I am moving in all 3 axes simultaneously. So you can see all 3 of those numbers updating as I click and drag. This is a nice, fast way to move an object around in 3D space, but it is not necessarily the most accurate way, because while it may look like you're in the right position, you may indeed not be, which is something we'll talk about here in just a brief moment. Now, one very cool thing about the Move manipulator that a lot of folks don't know or take for granted even after they do know it, is that you have the ability to move along planes. What I mean is move in 2 axes instead of 3 if you like. Now, as I mentioned just a second ago, if you zoom out, you can see that that centermost manipulator is a yellow square, and as I rotate around this object, you'll notice that square is always facing the camera.
It's always lying flat on our viewport.
That's right. The arrows point in different directions as we move around, but that square always remains constant. If I control-click on any one of these axes, for example, let's say I click on the control-click on the y-axis, look what happens to this square. Let me go ahead and just reselect our object. And it may be a little tricky to see, but that square is now flat. And it is laying across the X and Z planes. So now, if I slide this object down to the ground, if I grab that centermost manipulator and drag around, I am not moving the object up. Look over here inside my channel box. I am only updating in the X and Z axes. Notice that Y is staying right at 1.008. I can do this with any one axis. I can control-click on one axis, and we will no longer move in that axis. I just control-clicked on X. Now, watch my values over here. You'll notice that X will not move while I use the Move tool. So I'm just moving now in the plane created between the Y and the Z axes. So, if you need to get your manipulator back to its normal settings where you have that nice 3-dimensional movement, all you have to do is hold down Control and click on that yellow square once again. Now that yellow square faces the camera again, and you have full 3D motion right back where you left it. So in a nutshell, that is moving using the Move tool.
Now, of course, let me go ahead and point out that you can use the plus and minus keys to change the size of the visual manipulator if you'd like.
Sure, so plus is going to make your manipulator much bigger. Minus is going to make it smaller, but do realize if you try to zoom in to see this manipulator in clearer detail, your manipulator is independent of your camera position.
There's a really good shot now if you want to show the control clicking right in there.
Sure. So if I control click on Y, control click on X, control click on Z, what we're doing is we're canceling out movement in the axis that we control click.
Beautiful. So that's translating.
Yeah, that's
moving around.
That's translating. There are a couple of things I do want to mention real briefly. Of course, we have said in the past that you can enter numbers directly into the channel box. Brief thing, up on the top of your status line, if I collapse a few of these, we have the input section here at the very end, where if you bring down the drop-down, we have numeric inputs for absolute and relative. We can use this to move objects as well. We can use it for moving, rotating, and scaling, but in this case, for this video, I'm just going to demonstrate it for moving, and you guys can test it out later. If we choose absolute input, notice we get the little ABS here. In the very top, we can choose exactly what coordinates in 3D space we want this object to be. For example, I could say 0, space, 0, space, 0. One for each axis, X, then Y, then Z, always in that order. Press Enter, and we go right back to the origin. If I want it to be, say, 5 units straight up into the air, what is the up axis? It's the Y axis. So I say 0, space, 5, space, 0, Enter, and I move 5 units up.
And you can also enter the numbers individually as well.
That's right.
If you just go ahead and come over and click on, like, let's say you wanted to move it out in the Z direction, and you want it to go maybe 15 units out, like such. And actually, hang on, let's do this. There we go. We need to make sure that we actually have it selected.
There we go.
And then we're going to move it 15 units out.
So all we have to do is select the manipulator handle in the viewport.
Yeah. Just so everybody knows, I was having to lean all the way across Zach from that. It was a bit confusing.
Yeah, I understand. But if you just select any certain handle and you type in where you want that thing to be, say we want it to be 1 unit in Y, boom, and it jumps right down to 1 unit.
Very simple.
Underneath this, we have relative transformations, meaning it takes the current location of the object and adds to it. So just again for Y, if I now say 5 units,
it'd be 6 up.
We're 6 up, and you can see that confirmed over here inside the channel box. If I say 5 again, we're now 11 up, and so on.
Right.
So just another way to transform objects I thought I'd bring up because a lot of people overlook it, mostly because it's quite often hidden way at the end of the status line.
Mm-hmm.
So back to our transformation tools. We've pretty much beaten the move tool to death, so let's move on to the rotate tool. Rotate tool is going to be fairly simple. Just as an object in and of itself, you have 3 axes upon which you can rotate, given the X, Y, and Z rotations. And you have another circle on the far outside that you can use to rotate in screen space, which is kind of like rotating along the axis that points right out of the camera. And as you rotate around this, you'll notice that you're actually updating rotate X, Y, and Z. So it's really all there is to it. You grab, you rotate. There are some options for this, but we'll be discussing those later on as we work. Now let's go ahead and undo that. I'll straighten the object up, like so. And finally, we have scale. Now scale is going to work a lot like the move tool. We have a single axis pointed out in all of the 3 main axial directions. We can scale in any one of them. And if we use the centermost manipulator, which is a pale blue cube when non-selected and a yellow cube when it is selected, we have the ability to uniform scale. We do not, however, have the ability to control-click on a single axis the way we do with the move tool. That is a move tool-only function. So really, that's about it.
That's true. Now, these tools do have various options that you can set, and I'm just going to demonstrate one.
Sure.
Zach, go ahead and delete out that sphere and create a polygon cube real quick.
There it is.
Now let's go ahead and scale it up, kind of like a 2x4.
Oh, I got you. Sure. Maybe something kind of like so.
Okay. Now let's say that you rotate that around the x-axis.
So
there you go, about 45 degrees. That looks good. Now, grab your move tool. If you wanted to move this object along the angle that it is currently pointing, notice how difficult that would be right now. As a matter of fact, I mean, if you were to try to do it with what Zach has shown you so far, you'd want to come in here and control remove X. So now that you're moving along the plane of Y and Z. But, yeah, that's going to be pretty difficult.
Not very precise at all.
And this is where these tools become quite handy.
Now, Buzz just accessed those move tool settings by double-clicking the move tool over in the channel box.
That's right.
So from here, we have several options, but really we're only going to be harping on 2 of these settings. If you look over here at the top, we have the move settings here. We have world, we have object.
That's right. Now, there are other settings.
That's right. But
we'll talk about these other settings a little bit later.
We'll focus on these at another time. Notice with world, our axes for movement
Matches the world.
Always match the world. So like so. As soon as I switch over to object, now look at my move axes.
Convenient.
I am now moving along this object's local axes. So as I slide in Z, I am now moving along the plane of rotation as I've rotated the object up in the X direction.
So of course when you rotate it, it's a local rotation.
Sure.
Its local axis moved as well.
That's right.
Because it's now pointing in that direction. So if Zach was to grab the rotate tool again and rotate it to some crazy angle.
Sure, let's just do something kind of...
There you go. Now switch back over to the move tool, which you did by hitting W real quick.
That's right.
You notice that we can still quite easily move along its local axis.
That's right. The move tool has rotated as well, so I can bring this right along, just like this 2x4 was fired out of some sort of projectile launcher.
Very handy. Let's go ahead and reset those settings. I just wanted to point that out for those that start playing with
well,
objects.
Also, before we step away from that, I do also want to mention over in the channel box, while it looks like we are moving only in a single axis, watch those values in the channel box.
Absolutely.
We are moving in full 3D space along all three axes. So just something to keep in mind.
For sure.
All right, so let's go ahead and get those settings reset. I'll go back over into my tool options, which I can do by double-clicking the move tool, and we'll set this back to world, so something a little closer to what we're used to.
You could also, of course, just hit the reset tool button.
Absolutely, the reset tool button located here.
So let's go and switch back to the channel box.
All right.
And, all right, so now let's talk about moving objects around in 3D space. For beginners, they seem to pick up the nasty habit of working only in the perspective view. And this is fine once you have a better understanding of 3D space.
That's right.
A beginner often does not have this understanding.
And not all the time, but quite often, beginners don't really understand the concept of being in a three-axial world.
That's right. So, Zach, now that we've learned how to create some basic primitives, we've learned how to select them, and now we've learned how to transform them, use the perspective view to kind of demonstrate how to make, like, part of a screwed-up snowman.
A screwed-up snowman.
Yeah.
I know exactly what you mean.
All right, excellent.
To make it easier for everyone to see at home, or for everyone to visualize, I'm going to hide the grid.
Yeah.
So, let's go ahead and, without saying what I'm doing, I'll rotate the view to some odd angle.
Okay.
Nobody will notice.
Zach is now simulating the complete beginner.
Yeah, so here we go. We'll go under surfaces. I'll create a NURB sphere, and let's just go ahead and move that sphere to some place where I feel I could use it.
Okay.
And it needs to be a little bit bigger, so let's just go ahead and scale it.
Okay.
And something about like so.
And you go ahead and rotate it if you want, just so it kind of looks like it's standing up. Yeah.
So we'll stand it up a little bit, and let me make sure that I have it where I need it to be. So, of course, this is going to take probably a few movements on my part, but that's okay. As long as I get it right where I want it to be, and everything looks good in this view, everything's fine.
There you go. That's good enough.
There we go. I like it.
So let's go ahead and make another sphere.
Okay, well, I've got another sphere. There he is. So let's move him into position, and let's see. Try to make sure he's moved. Kind of hard to get the hang of these controls when you haven't been doing this before. So let's scale this up, and of course it needs to be rotated as well, so we'll try to stand that up. Come here, you. Something kind of...
Yeah, that looks good.
All right.
Perfect. Deselect.
Yeah.
Yeah, Snowman coming along.
Oh, yeah.
Making another sphere.
And I can't see that, so I'll pull him over
just
here.
Scale him
I'll
up
just
where
scale
he's at,
him up.
yeah.
So that looks pretty good. I'll just pull back with the camera just a little bit. And, of course, I need to rotate that around as well.
Hey, there you go.
Yeah.
Look at that.
A little bit bigger. The head's too small.
Okay, so there you go. Zach has constructed what he thinks is the perfect snowman.
That's right.
Of course, he is new to working in 3D space and elected to use the perspective view to design this way. Now, you'll notice that Zach had a bit of a hard time putting it together because once you have an understanding of 3D space, it's actually hard to do this.
Yeah.
But for the complete beginner, it never ceases to amaze me. They find this very easy.
That's right.
Zach, show me the problem with this guy.
Well, if I go back, let me switch the grid back on. That'll be the first indication of what's going on that's a problem. So, boom.
Okay, but grid. Even if that, maybe we wanted him on this angle.
Okay.
Zach still successfully managed.
Still was successful.
Oh, that's absolutely awesome.
That's rich. It really is. It's this weird sort of unlearn what you have learned thing. Real quick, here's what we're trying to demonstrate. And it's like as soon as you do it once, as soon as you get the hang of 3D space,
it's hard.
Then messing it up is really a difficult thing. The whole unlearn everything that you have learned and focused on.
Let me see. Let me see.
I got this. I got this.
Sure?
Here you go. Okay. Here you go. I got you your warped snowman. So let's see. Let's move them out here. Oh, well, look at that. Look at that. way out there in the distance.
There you go. Now just scale him up.
We'll just scale him up. So that looks a whole lot better now. And now let's, of course, create another sphere, and I'll just fire him something like this, because I've actually seen this in class before, and it scares me every time. So
there we go.
instant snowman.
That's right. So now that we have our snowman, now let's rotate around and see what's
As soon as we rotate the viewport, we find a problem.
Yeah, he's not exactly a snowman.
And the spheres are in exactly the reverse order. I'm going to undo my camera movements, which is something that you can actually do with the left and right bracket keys.
Yeah, we'll talk more about this.
I'll talk more about that later, but just as a quick tip. So I'll back up to where we see the snowman. And this is really funny. The frontmost or largest piece actually has the smallest scale. It's about 7.1. The next body piece is 13.9, meaning it's actually bigger than this guy.
Further away, so it needed to be scaled up larger.
Right, and then this guy, he's huge. He's 23. So he's like 3 times the size of the body, but you can't tell from here. Everything looks
select
fine.
the little head. Now this is what looks like the smallest from this view, but go ahead and rotate.
And just kind of zoom out so that you can see everything. In fact, this guy's really far out in the distance.
Yeah.
So that is our snowman.
There we go. It's funny. It's difficult for Zach to achieve the effect because he's used to working in 3D space.
I've been working in 3D space for so long.
Please
it's
make
hard
sure
to break.
you don't do this. Zach, let's go and do a new scene real quick. Let's construct a basic snowman for them.
Sure.
And you can go ahead and turn your grid back on as well.
Yeah, we'll need the grid. Well, something that I do notice, the problem that you just saw happen with the snowman, the primary reason I ever see this pop up with rookie students, beginners at 3D, is because they'll do 2 major problems, 2 major trip-ups that I see quite a bit. The first one is not using rotation of the viewport. If you're going to work in perspective, that's fine, but rotate the viewport a lot, because right now you're looking at a monitor. A monitor is a 2-dimensional surface. It is a flat thing. Your brain will see that as a flat thing.
Constantly rotating the viewport will keep your mind in sync with the 3D world in which you're working.
That's right. It'll always refresh your brain and say, hey, this is 3D and not 2D. The other thing, another reason perhaps that students end up doing this, is because a lot of them will get lazy when they're using Maya. And they'll maybe be a little tired. It's toward the end of the day, and they'll do something I've seen 1,000 times. They'll take their elbow and put it on the desk, and they will put their chin in their hand while they're using Maya. So they're using Maya just with one hand on the mouse, meaning that you don't have a key that you can hit to rotate the viewport, so they just don't do it. Every time I've ever seen a student in class propping their head up like that, I always sneak up behind them and pull the prop out so they'll slam into the desk or something, because that's a real bad way to do it. Always, when you're using Maya, please have one hand on the keyboard at all times, just so that you can real quickly rotate.
And the other thing is, for some reason, a lot of beginners like to hide that grid. That grid is your friend. It's a crutch while you guys are learning how to manipulate and work inside of 3D space.
And don't think the grid is just for rookies either. I mean, I've been using Maya now for years, and I almost never switch the grid off.
Well, the grid can almost be a tool itself, and we'll talk about that later. Yeah.
So let's create a snowman, a proper snowman this time.
And we're also going to go ahead and take a look at 4 views in doing this. Because
I'll just build the whole thing in the 4 view.
Okay, because my opinion is the beginner should get very comfortable with working with a top, a front, and a side view, not only a perspective view.
Well, a lot of beginners will find the perspective view very natural, because that's how you see things in everyday life. And because of that, they don't want to step into the realm of orthographic views, because, you're really not used to seeing that unless you're an architect or something. So it's good to force yourself to get in the habit of looking at these views so that later on you have a much better concept of how they relate to 3-dimensional space.
That's right.
So we'll begin by creating a sphere. And I'll take this sphere and we'll scale it up to form the bottom of the body.
Here we are, transforming our geometry.
That's right. Notice I'm over here inside the front view, so we'll do a lot of viewport popping. Of course, I'm just tapping the space bar to do that. So here in the front view, nice and big where everybody can see it, we'll move this sphere up right on top of the grid itself. Notice when I move it on top of this thick black line, over here in perspective, he's sitting right on top of the main construction grid. Just something to be aware of. Now, we'll pick on the side view for a moment. It's still an orthographic view that gives us essentially the same style of view. So we'll create another sphere. We'll move up a little bit, scale again, set down on top of the first sphere, go into perspective, and just see where we are. Things are lining up very nicely. If we want to work in perspective just a little bit, of course we can do that. Create a sphere. Move straight up. Notice I'm just using one axis. I am not using this center manipulator. If I were to do that, for example, if I just say I'm going to move the sphere up and scale like so, I immediately get into that problem we were talking about earlier. try to get in the habit of moving, at least for starters, one axis at a time. So we'll move up in Y, and then we'll scale up uniformly to create our head. So maybe scale down a little more. And if we look in the front and side views, of course, it looks like a snowman from here.
And look at the top view. You'll notice how all three spheres are lined up with each other.
3 concentric spheres.
Very nice.
So there you go. There's a very basic snowman. Now what if we wanted to add some props? So let's go. I'm going to shade up my perspective view so that as I reference back to that, you can actually see this snowman kind of sort of come to life. Now, the orthographic views are going to become very, very important as we start to build pieces of this snowman. All I'm going to build for this example is maybe a couple of eyes, some buttons on the chest, a carrot nose, and some sticks for arms. Maybe a top hat if I'm feeling really, really nice. So let's go ahead and start with the eyes. We'll make some more NURB spheres. Now, where are we going to put the eyes? Of course, they have to go on the front of the object. How can I designate exactly what is front and what is back in an orthographic view? Well, I would do that from the side. So if I'm looking at the side, this is the front, this is the back. How am I designating one from the other? Take a look at the axes on the left-hand side. The Z-axis pointer here in the lower corner, notice Z is pointing off to the left. Z, if we think of that as positive, that's going to be forward.
It's coming right out at you.
That's right. It's exactly right. So we'll assume that that is our forward direction. I'll scale down my little button. In fact, let's set this to a solid setting so I can make all 3 buttons the same size. I'll set this to 0.4, like so.
Okay.
And now we'll grab the Move tool, and I'll move this so that it's just here in the side view, sticking out of the surface of the middle part of the chest inside. Now, if I come to the perspective view, look what we got. Nice and lined up. So let's go back into the side view. I'll create a new sphere. Again, I'll set its scale to 0.4. And we'll move it just below the first one. Again, just working in the side view. We'll create another sphere, same thing, 0.4 in scale, and move to the front of our body. So if we come into perspective, we have these 3 nice, big, cute buttons. So, looking pretty good. Now, we need to put some eyes in. Now, eyes are not going to be running down the center of our snowman. They're going to be off to the side, and they're still going to need to push out of the front of the body so they're not completely inside the snowball for the head. This means we're going to have to line them up in more than one view. So let's go ahead and do that. I'll go back into my orthographic view for the side, and we'll go to a NURB sphere, and I'll move this up to the head. We'll scale it down. I'll just kind of start by scaling by hand. Looks like about 0.25 will work well. And we'll move this, like I was saying, let's just try something similar to what we did with the buttons. We're pointing out of the head now. So if I come over here into my view, I have a cycloptic snowman. And so your first instinct may be, well, that's okay. I can just slide it here in the x-axis. I can, for example, I could go into the front view and move it off to the side about where it should be for an eye. The problem with this is a spherical surface, meaning that because we were moving in a straight line, we were moving a little bit out of its surface, just a tad. So if we want, we can come into perspective and just slide back a little bit. We can make adjustments in perspective if we want, but I really want to stress that it's important to get used to working in your orthographic views. So let's create another sphere. I'll go back to the Create menu for this one. So NURBS Primitives Sphere. We'll set our scales to 0.25 in all 3 axes. I'm going to do something kind of interesting here. I'm just going to move my sphere out here in the middle of nowhere. Now, let's look at the location of this sphere. Talk about numerical entries for positioning objects. I have a translate x of negative 0.388, translate y of 10.892, and a translate z of 1.155. My 2 eyes are going to be right next to each other in the forward direction. I mean, most of you, as far as I know, probably don't have one eye that sits a little more forward than the other. If so, it's at a microscopic level. You shouldn't worry about it anyways.
True.
So we want our 2 eyes to be on the same plane, the same level in Z.
So translate Y and Z are both going to match.
They're going to be the same things. So we could write that value down and type it in, or since we're all proficient computer users, we'll select translate Y for starters, and we'll hit Control-C. I'll move over here to my my other sphere, and we'll hit Control-V to paste in. So I'm just copying and pasting, just like any Windows app. Press Enter, and boom. Now they are the same level in the Y-axis. So if I slide him over real nice and easy, you'll see they kind of line up real nicely. In fact, in the front view, you can see this excellently. Look at this. I can make them line up perfectly in the front view. But, as we can see, they're not lined up perfectly. So we also need them to have the same Z or Z translate, so I'll select my eye again. 1.155, Control-C to copy. Back over here to this eye. Control-V to paste. Pow. Now, here's the catch. I could just move this to the other side where I think it needs to be and just kind of eyeball that. Ha-ha. Okay, so no laughs
no
from
pun
that.
intended.
Yeah, no laughs from that. That's fine. I'll just move on to the rest of my evening. Now, what we could do, though, is we can select our first eye. Let's say we assume this guy's positioned right where we want him to be. Since we're building this snowman right down the center axis, and we can assume that the whole thing's going to be symmetrical, we can say translate x is set to negative 0.388. Great. So we'll set this guy to positive 0.388. Notice I didn't have to type the 0 in the beginning. Press enter. Boom. He pops to the exact opposite location. So with that, I have my two eyes in place. Things are looking pretty good. Let's build a cute little carrot nose. We'll create a NURBS cone. And I'll move this up. Right now it looks kind of like a dunce cap.
Yes, it does.
So let's use some of the techniques we learned earlier. I'm going to control-click on the x-axis so that we're just moving in the YZ plane. And I'll move this around to the front of my snowman. Now, I'm going to rotate this forward. I can do this freehand if I want. Or I could come in numerically and in the x-axis type in, say, 90 degrees. Or if I need something that's not quite so perfect, we could say 95 degrees, and now it looks like he's wearing some kind of weird mask.
Now, we did mention this in a previous lesson, and we didn't really drill on it before we began doing this, but the hotkeys, you guys saw earlier where Zach said that Q was for just the simple select tool, W is the move tool, and then E is the rotate tool, and R is the scale tool.
That's right, and I use those a lot, so I'm sorry if I've been taking that for granted. I've just been... I'm a hotkey guy.
Yep,
I am the hotkey guy. So I'm going to go to my inputs. Instead of scaling, we'll just kind of swap things up a little bit. I'll adjust my radius. Now you'll notice as I'm adjusting the radius, you'll see that the whole cone is scaling. This is something I want to bring up because it confuses some people at first. The reason this is happening is because this NURBS cone works off a height ratio. It's a ratio between the height and the radius. As long as that ratio doesn't change, a change in the radius is going to look like a uniform scale. So as we increase the height ratio, boom, we get a longer little carrot nose. Really long carrot nose. Right about so. So now I'll move that up right in between the eyes. Looking good. Really, really quick, let's make a top hat. So to do this, I'm going to grab a polygon cylinder. So I'll create a polygon cylinder like so, and we'll move this right up on top of the head. Maybe make a couple of scale adjustments. Let's say a little bit taller of a top hat, a little bit wider. Move up to right about here. We'll make a brim for the hat so it doesn't look like a fez or something. And we'll scale up a bit, and then we'll just squash down. Maybe it's a little too big. We'll make this thin like a coin.
Notice how he's jumping back and forth, utilizing the different stems of the tool here.
That's right. I'm using all of my different axes, and notice how I'm flashing around in the different viewports very quickly. This is something I would really like you to practice and get used to. If you know that you can get away with moving something in an orthographic view, please do it. At least if you're a beginner in 3D, it's going to make moving in 3D much easier later on down the road.
That's right.
So we have a top hat for our snowman. Let's make some arms. So real quick, go into the front view. We have a polygon cylinder that, of course, I just created with a single click from the shelf. We'll move it up here to the shoulder area. I'll rotate it. Now, just a really fast thing. I'll scale it down to where it's really tiny and then scale it up only in its y-axis. Notice how the scale manipulator has rotated along with the cylinder? So, it's like a local scale. You scale out about like so. Maybe I'll rotate that back a little bit. Something kind of like that. Now, let's do the same thing here for another arm. So, maybe this one I'll rotate down. No, maybe not that far down. I'm picky, I know. So now we'll scale this down, scale out only in Y, a little too long, and move that out to about the shoulder realm. Now just because I think it's funny, we'll add just a little hand up here on this arm. He can be one-handed for now. I don't want a polygon sphere. Let's go back to a NURBS sphere. We'll keep trading up objects. So we'll stick that way out here at the end of the hand. Now, if you are not sure that two objects are going to be aligned, because you can never really be sure in an orthographic view, remember to swap up to another view and just make sure. I mean, even if you're relatively certain, if there's any doubt, make sure you double check yourself. It's just going to help you out later. So a couple more things I want to add, and then I promise we'll be done. So we have it's a NURB cylinder. That's okay. I'll just make use of it. We'll scale this guy down, and we'll increase his length a little bit. And let's see. Let's go ahead and rotate him out about like so. Now, just because I'm rushing, I'll hit Control-D to make a copy of him. So that's a duplicate. Rotate over like so. And now he's throwing up the 2 horn side. So there you go. There's our snowman. And just have a real quick little bit of fun. You can pay attention to what I'm doing or not, because everything I'm about to do we're going to discuss later. I'm going to select the whole snowman. Hit Control-G to put him inside of a group. Under my animation menu set, we'll go under Deform, Create Nonlinear. We'll throw on a Bend Deformer. I'm going to move that down to about the origin. Under my inputs, I'll bring my low bound all the way up to 0. I'll take my high bound up past the top of my snowman's head using my virtual slider. And now with that done, we can take our curvature and... Oh, well, that's okay. Let's rotate that around in 90 degrees in the y-axis. Now watch this.
Now it's the talented snowman.
The talented head-banging snowman. Yeah.
There you go.
He's at a concert right now.
So basically, in this video here, what we've done is we've taken a look at how you can go about manipulating the objects that you create. Primarily move, rotate, and scale. We've looked at their manipulators, took a really quick look at both object space and world space with the Move Tool settings. And okay, that's scary.
He's
and
Sorry.
And we discussed the hotkeys, Q being the select tool, W being move, E being rotate, R being scale. And those are lower case letters, by the way.
That's right. Do not put your caps lock key on.
That's right. And finally, we discussed manipulating the objects in 3D sense, where you got to keep in mind where you are in 3D space and the importance of continuously rotating the perspective view so that you have a continued sense of where these objects exist. So with that, that's going to wrap up this lesson on manipulating objects.